Now we're live.
Boa tarde a todos. Podemos começar? Boa tarde a todos. Eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas a todos aqueles que estão nos assistindo e agradecer também a presença daqueles que estão aqui. Desculpem, acho que eu perdi aqui acho que eu perdi um minuto aqui. Bom, desculpem, deixa eu começar de novo. Então, nós temos o prazer de ter aqui conosco hoje o professor Tom Keymer, e eu vou passar para apresentá-lo em inglês, né? E nós estamos oferecendo essa segunda palestra pelo Laboratório de Estudos do Romance, em parceria com o Departamento de Letras Modernas e Departamento de Teoria Literária e Literatura Comparada da USP. É um prazer enorme ter o professor Tom Keymer conosco novamente, e eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação dele e imediatamente passar a palavra para ele. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you with us again. I wish we could have you every month to give us, one of your absolutely interesting and thought-provoking talks. Unfortunately, we can only sort of disturb you from time to time. But anyway, I would like to thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I would also like to ask you permission to give a very, very short presentation of your very, very, let's say, massive academic biography. Professor Tom Keymer is a professor of English at the University of Toronto, and he's been also, he also taught here in England at the Royal Holloway, University of London, and also St. Anne's College, Oxford. But he's been in Toronto for many years now. And what is really amazing about Tom is that he has a very, very wide range of interests. And I'm going to mention some of them. So Tom works mainly on restoration, the 18th century, Romantic era British and Irish literature, with a special focus on narrative and the novel. But he also works on book history and print culture, literature, politics, and national identities, literature and law, life writing and subjectivity, theories of intertextuality, influence and reception, and the theory and practice of textual editing. Now, Tom has published profusely. He's got a number of very, very important books, books that actually are part of our course biographies, bibliographies, and they are mainly, I think they concentrate more on the, let's say, 18th century and early 19th century. I'm going to mention some of them, apart from the books that he has edited with other colleagues. He published more recently Poetics of the Pillory, English Literature and Seditious Libel, covering the period from 1660 to 1820, that was published in 2019. And even more recently, Jane Austen, Writing, Society, Politics, by the Oxford University Press in 2020. And even more recently, 2022, Jane Austen, A Very Short Introduction, which is part of the Oxford University Press collection of short introductions on a wide variety of subjects. And this is a book that we can highly recommend to all those who would like to have, this sort of these introductory studies about Austen. Tom, I think I'm now passing the floor to you And thank you again for your generosity and kindness.
Thank you for such a generous introduction. Does the sound work all right here? Am I the right kind of volume? Good.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much.
I'm also going to disappear. Okay, we are going to leave the screen all to yourself, but I'll be back here if you, in case you need anything. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
And this is one of the worst things about virtual meetings, that feeling that one might be in the most enormous bloated presence on a large screen. So please do minimize me if you would like. That might be better. Anyway, I did want to thank Sandra, Professor Vasconcelos, for that very generous introduction, and for my third invitation now to your amazing university. The last two times that I was privileged to visit your beautiful campus and to see your amazing Biblioteca Brasiliana and this wonderful city that you live in. And I have very, very happy memories of that. I'm happy here to be with you virtually as well this time. And to talk about Jane Austen, as Professor Vasconcelos mentioned, I did just complete the very short introduction to Jane Austen. As she said, it's in a big series. The book I would really like to have written was the very short introduction to dinosaurs. There's a very short introduction to everything: black holes, financial crashes, anything you can imagine. But I did manage to bring dinosaurs into the very short introduction to Jane Austen, partly in fulfillment of a bet, but partly because actually some of the first dinosaur discoveries were made close to a seaside town that Jane Austen visited late in life, and she almost certainly met the woman Mary Anning, about whom a movie was recently made, who made those discoveries. Anyway, I mustn't digress. I'm here to talk about Northanger Abbey, and it's a real pleasure to be talking about that in your laboratory for the study of the novel, because it's a work that I think is really well suited to this forum. For the following reason: of all Jane Austen's novels, 6 novels, this is the one in which she's most self-conscious about the novel form, about its conventions, its reputation, and especially its capacity to absorb readers and shape their ways of perceiving their own experience in the world. In that respect, it's a novel that plays ingeniously on the centuries-old tradition of Don Quixote, but it does so with reference. Austen updates it. It does so with reference now to the very newly fashionable genre of Gothic fiction, which was a craze in the 1790s when Austen first drafted the novel. This is a genre in which the heroine, Catherine Morland, immerses herself in the modish circulating libraries of the city of Bath in the novel's first volume. It's a genre that then colours her response to the pseudo-Gothic environment of Northanger Abbey in the second volume. This is a novel also marked by a very unusual and startling moment when, in chapter 5 of volume 1, Austen drops her habitual mode of narrative indirection. She's typically, of course, a very reticent, quiet presence in her novels, and talks directly to readers in the first person about the merits of the novel genre in relation to other genres that were then more prestigious. So it's a very unusual gesture for her to do this, and it's an important landmark historically in the elevation of the novel genre and its ascent towards a prestige that it reaches after her death, much later in the 19th century. So there's a lot to consider here in terms of generic conventions and narrative technique. And since I'm currently editing this novel, Northanger Abbey, for the Oxford World's Classics series, these are things I'm thinking about at the moment. But Northanger Abbey is also very intriguing in terms of its long, tangled, and still somewhat mysterious history of composition and revision and publication. And this is a topic on which new evidence and new theories are still emerging. So the novel was almost certainly drafted in 1798. 1799, right at the end of the 18th century, just a few years after the French Revolution had reached its bloody climax with the terror of 1793, 1794. She sold it successfully to a publisher a few years later, 1803, with Europe now embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars. But after a long period when nothing happened, it was not in fact published until 1817 and by a different bookseller after she had died, a few months after Austen's death. The interesting thing here is that the difficulties Austen faced in getting the novel into print connect with the focal points of generic self-consciousness that I've just mentioned. The reputation of the novel genre, its treatment by booksellers and reviewers, and second, Austen's satirical approach to Gothic fiction, which, according to one theory about the checkered publishing history of this book, may in fact have jinxed publication, may have prevented it from getting published. So what I'm doing in this talk then is taking really a book historical approach to Northanger Abbey and its emergence into print, in the hope of showing how book historical and narratological or genre-based approaches can be mutually illuminating methodologies. As I proceed, I'll really be documenting the work I've been doing on the World's Classics edition, establishing the text, writing introductions, preparing explanatory footnotes, that kind of thing. So I'll mention that along the way in the hope of giving some insights not only into the publishing history of Northanger Abbey at the time, in Austen's own day, but also into the process of how you put together a new edition for 21st century students and scholars. Forgive me, though, for taking one little detour first. Marianne, could we have that first slide? Because Northanger Abbey is, thank you, is also a novel that rather surprisingly hit the headlines in England a few months ago, when somebody at the University of Greenwich in London attached to it a trigger warning. Now, I don't know if trigger warnings are a feature of Brazilian university culture. Google Translate tells me a trigger warning in Portuguese is aviso de gatilho. Forgive my pronunciation. A trigger warning, anyway, a warning that there might be something alarming in the text. Even if you are familiar with these, I would guess you wouldn't expect Jane Austen to need a trigger warning. As the headline says, it's hardly Game of Thrones. Northanger Abbey is hardly Game of Thrones. In fact, as Austen famously writes in a letter to her sister about Pride and Prejudice, the problem with that novel is that it's not really disturbing enough. She said the work is rather too light and bright and sparkling. It wants shade, meaning it lacks darkness. It needs a bit more of an edge. Northanger Abbey, however, was deemed at the University of Greenwich to represent toxic friendship. And it's true, it does. In one of the novel's deftest lines, Catherine, the heroine, and Isabella, her friend, or in that useful word that we have now, frenemy, are walking along through the streets of Bath, and we're told her arm, Catherine's arm, was still linked within Isabella's, though their hearts were at war. Their arms still linked, their hearts at war. So yes, indeed, Austen is a brilliant satirist of toxic friendship. Do we need a trigger warning, though? I quote this Guardian columnist, Catherine Bennett, and I put the relevant passage. I probably made this too small, but you might be able to see it on the screen. You have to admire the ingenuity of the Greenwich English department, she says, determined to pin a TW, a trigger warning, on one of the least troubling novels by an author whose critics dwell on her alleged superficiality and placidity. And as this columnist goes on, she's obviously learned something about irony from reading Austen. As this columnist goes on, although in the decades since classroom trigger warnings were pioneered by Oberlin College in the US, these alerts have surged in both prevalence and ambition. The Greenwich academics deserve recognition for achieving, with Northanger Abbey, what is surely peak TW, peak trigger warning. I leave that with you anyway. So back to the main business. Marianne, could we have the next slide? I'm going to start with, thank you, one of the most famous and important early documents in Austen scholarship, though, as you can see, there's not much of it. It's a frustratingly brief fragment. It's a memorandum written by Jane Austen's sister Cassandra within a few months of Austen's death in July 1817. And Cassandra is trying to reconstruct a timeline of composition for the 6 novels. Now, you think of the original Cassandra at Troy, we associate her with prophecy, not memory. This Cassandra seems to have had pretty good memory. No one was closer to Austen throughout her life, and other bits of evidence suggest that this is a pretty reliable timeline. So don't worry about the handwriting. I just wanted to show you the original document. I'm going to read it to you. First impressions begun in October 1796, finished in August 1797, published afterwards with alterations and contractions under the title of Pride and Prejudice. Sense and Sensibility begun November 1797, and then Cassandra adds, I'm sure that something of the same story in Cassandra's, same story in characters had been written earlier and called Eleanor and Marianne. Then Mansfield Park begun somewhere about February 1811, finished soon after June 1813. Emma begun January 21st, 1814, finished March 29th, 1815. Persuasion begun August 1815, finished August 1816. And then last, on the next page, Northanger Abbey, that's how she spells it. There are reasons for that. We can, I won't go into that now. Northanger Abbey was written about the years 98 and 99. Now, this is quite a strange document. And Freya Johnston, in her new book, Jane Austen, Early and Late, has recently interrogated it in a very thoughtful way. I'd recommend that reading of it to you. But for now, the one basic bit of context you need in order to understand just how odd the contents of this document are is that although Austen was born in 1775 and was already writing prolifically in her early teens, none of her novels made it into print until 1811, when she's in her late 30s. And that's Sense and Sensibility. After a time lag of nearly a decade and a half from when she first wrote it, or maybe even a bit more. We know that Austen tried to publish First Impressions, the original version of Pride and Prejudice, as early as 1797, when she's 21, 22. Soon after completing the novel, she submitted it via her father to an upscale London bookseller named Thomas Cadell. And Cadell is one of the most famous mistakes in book history, publishing history. Rejected it without even reading it, and it didn't then appear until 1813, again with a different publisher, probably after a lot of revision. Now, plenty of novels were getting published in the 1790s, especially the sentimental novels, the Gothic novels that were in vogue. If we go to the next image, the next slide, that kind of illustrates the point. So the next slide, Mariana, that's it. Great, thank you. The one before, if you're able to go back. It's just a satirical image of a circulating library, a fashionable library. Probably, I've actually forgotten the date of it. I think it's very early 1800s, but it illustrates the point. You can see the basic joke. Here are these fashionable young women in the library, and the shelves of histories and sermons and everything else are all full, but the novels and the romances, they've all gone. They've been stripped out. This is what people are reading. And if we go to the next image, it sort of really tells us the same story. Yeah, this one is fantastic. You could talk about this for an hour. There's so much in there. What's on the wall, what's on the mantelpiece, the candles, all the little details that this great artist Gilray uses to amplify the meaning of this satirical image. But above all, it's an image of absorptive reading. It's an image of four highly fashionable, look at the way they're dressed, highly fashionable women reading Matthew Lewis's 1796 novel, The Monk, which is probably the most shocking, the most thrilling Gothic novel of them all. So that's the vogue. This is what everybody wants to read, but it's not what Austen is doing. She's not writing in these in-demand genres. She's a first-time novelist, cold calling a prestigious publisher with Pride and Prejudice, with whom she had no established relationship, so she gets nowhere. And she's doing so at a time when, as she writes in chapter 5 of Northanger Abbey, the reputation of novels was low and the default posture of book reviewers to novels was hostile. Let me just put that remarkable passage on the screen then. I'll ask Marianne to put it on the screen. The next slide. And this is where, I'm not going to read this whole passage, but it's where Catherine Heron and Isabella meet to read novels together. And then Austen says, yes, novels. And this is, this, as I said, this very unusual thing, Austen just coming out of the narrative, like Fielding or some other self-conscious novelist, talking in the first person, her own voice. For I will not adopt that ungenerous and impolitic custom so common with novel writers of degrading by the contemptuous censure the very performances to the number of which they are themselves adding, joining with their greatest enemies to bestowing the harshest epithets on such works. And she goes on a little lower down. Let us leave it to the reviewers to abuse such effusions of fancy at their leisure, and over every new novel to talk in threadbare strains of the trash with which the press now groans. Novelists need to stick together, she says. They need to boost their genre. They not apologize for it, because it is an important genre. And she's going on to say that what is now, fashionable, or what is now prestigious, is actually less interesting. So she says, and while the abilities, again, I'm skipping down a little bit, and while the abilities of the 900th abridger of the history of England, or the man who collects and publishes some dozen lines of Milton, Pope, and Prior, prestigious poets, with a paper from the Spectator and a chapter from Sterne are eulogized by 1,000 pens, there seems almost a general wish of decrying the capacity and undervaluing the labor of the novelist, and of sliding the performances which have only genius, wit, and taste to recommend them. And then she goes on imagining a young woman apologizing for reading novels. Oh, it's only a novel, replies the young lady, while she lays down her book with affected indifference or momentary shame. It's only Cecilia or Camilla or Belinda, or in short, only some work in which, and here's the climax of the passage, the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. This then is the generically hostile environment in which Austen was trying to publish, where prestige still attaches to history or epic or sermons or periodical essays. And the market leaders are canonically conservative anthologies, like very famous book at the time, Vicesimus Knox's Elegant Extracts, which is actually an anthology that Austen is writes quite affectionately about elsewhere. But here it sort of sums up all the forces in the book trade that are pushing novels to the margin. One of the things I did when annotating this chapter for the new edition was test out that expression she uses, the trash with which the press now groans. In reviewing periodicals of the age, many of these are now digitized. They're searchable. They're on Google Books, an awful lot of them. The critical review, the monthly review of that period, freely accessible. And it turns out Austen wasn't making up that exact phrase. That exact phrase appears with many of the same kind in reviews at the time, nearly always dismissive about new novels in the 1790s. And in fact, it's still being used in the 18 teens when the novel finally gets published. This is almost a literal quotation that she's putting in there. One other just little interesting thing, by the way, although Cassandra tells us that Northanger Abbey was first drafted in 1798, 1799, one of those novels she mentions, Cecilia Camilla Belinda by Maria Edgeworth, actually hadn't been written at that point. It wasn't published until 1801. So this is a later insertion, or at least it's a passage that she comes back to and revises and expands from whatever might have been there in the first version. So anyway, it's thanks to this memorandum, Cassandra's memorandum, that scholars still often divide Jane Austen's 6 major novels into 2 groups of 3. On the one hand, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Northanger Abbey, the so-called Steventon novels, because that's where she was living, little village called Steventon. in her early 20s when she drafted them. And then people talk, on the other hand, about the kind of mature novels, the Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion, novels composed much closer to the time of publication, when Austen is in her late 30s, early 40s, and living in another village, Chawton. So those are the Chawton novels. And Chawton, incidentally, is where there's a museum in the house where she used to live, and it's an amazing museum, and it's got great web exhibitions as well, so you can visit it virtually. It's really worth Googling and spending a bit of time there. So that's a distinction you might see sometimes between two groups of Austen novels. It's been contested by the leading textual scholar, Catherine Sutherland, who points to compelling evidence that Austen's creativity was more of a continuum, with early drafts being substantially revised at later dates, and later novels sometimes drawing on early manuscripts like the 1804 fragment, The Watsons. So while it can be tempting to divide Austen into two discrete categories, three clever, self-conscious, but kind of juvenile experiments from her youth, then later three psychologically complex, technically flawless, mature achievements, that really simplifies the reality. As Sutherland insists, narratives of development based on simple distinctions between early and late falsify Jane Austen's practice. So there's another way of dividing the novels, which is maybe more useful. And again, it's two groups, but this time we might think in terms of the print Austen and the manuscript Austen. So the print Austen, meaning the 6 novels that were published during or immediately after her lifetime, none of which, except for a few little fragments, survives in manuscript, because at this time, printers habitually discarded manuscripts when typesetting was complete. Austen was little known. She wasn't famous. The cult of the autograph was still in its infancy, just beginning, but not a big thing. So why bother to keep a manuscript that had served its purpose? We might think now how the rest of our lives would play out if we happened to own and be able to sell Austen's original manuscript to Pride and Prejudice. Don't get too carried away with that thought. But back in 1813, somebody almost certainly used it to light a fire. As for Northanger Abbey, all we have of the original manuscript is a 6-word draft title page reading Susan, a novel in 2 volumes, now in New York, because the heroine, Catherine, was originally called Susan, and that was the title under which Austen expected to publish the novel in 1803. I'll come back to that in a minute. So this means the textual part of editing Northanger Abbey today is wonderfully simple. No manuscripts, no lifetime editions that Austen might have, had a role in. So it's not like Mansfield Park, say, where you've got 2 different versions that are really quite significantly different, and you've got to navigate between them. We have just this immediately posthumous edition of Northanger Abbey, supervised by Austen's brother, Henry, and it seems to be very accurate, with just a few very small misprints to puzzle over. So it's a very simple situation textually. However, the situation is very different, fascinatingly so, in the case of the manuscript works that Austen never published. Above all, the unfinished Sanditon. And she wrote 10 chapters of Sanditon, so maybe like 20% of what a full-length novel would have been. She wrote 10 chapters in the year of her death, and then she just had to stop. She was too sick. And that gives us an amazing glimpse into her creative process, while also presenting modern editors with a fascinating problem. How do you record all the changes she's making, and how do you present this effectively to a modern reader? So allow me to just briefly digress about this, because if we could we have the next slide? If we look at the opening sentence of Sanditon in manuscript, which I think is the next slide, Mariana, if that's coming up. There it is. Brilliant. Thank you. We had a slightly frantic hour before this talk started, sending the slides from Toronto to London and Chandra sending them from London to Sao Paulo. Anyway, we got them. This is the opening page of the Sanditon manuscript with a transcription on the other side. I just want to read the first sentence because this just disproves any idea that the sense of casual conversational spontaneity that we get from reading a Jane Austen's novel was casual and spontaneous. It really wasn't. Look at how heavily she's revising this page. We see her painstakingly refining and nuancing her prose, and doing so, really cleverly in a way here that in the first sentence thematically announces the theme of the novel. And this is a novel about business, about commerce, about real estate development, and about the way these things drive and obsess people. It's about people trying to develop a new seaside resort out of nothing. And she develops this even in the very first sentence. So I will read, first of all, how she first writes it before she makes changes. And it says, a gentleman and lady traveling from Tunbridge towards that part of the Sussex coast, which lies between Hastings and Eastbourne, were, on quitting the high road and toiling up a very long steep hill through a rough lane, overturned in toiling up its long ascent. So that's how she wrote it. The sentence gets the job done. It gives us the setting. It starts off the action, gives us the first two characters. But there's nothing very interesting about it. There's nothing interesting stylistically about it. It's even a little bit clunky with that repetition of toiling up. So she revises it, and suddenly it just comes to life. And we don't know, exactly when she does it. She's maybe doing that as she writes. Maybe she's coming back the next day and looking at it, but there's not a long time lag anyway. And this is how it ends up. A gentleman and lady travelling from Tunbridge towards that part of the Sussex coast which lies between Hastings and Eastbourne, being induced by business to quit the high road and attempt a very rough lane, were overturned in toiling up its long ascent, half rock, half sand. Brilliant. Being induced by business. So suddenly she's introduced this idea of business, commerce, real estate development. Speculation is one of the key words in the 10 chapters that we have of this novel. Speculation. These are people speculating on the development of this resort, this business activity that they're engaged in. But it's not just that. It's the fact that it's not that they're controlling it. It's controlling them. They are induced, they are led, they're forced by business to do this thing. So she's introduced two really important ideas that are going to dominate the narrative to come. And then the last bit is just fantastic. The novel, of course, is called Sanditon. We don't know that that was her title, but that's the name she gives the place, the health resort that they're trying to develop on the coast, Sanditon. So, it already suggests the idea of building on sand. And in case we missed that, she gets it into the first sentence here, half rock, half sand. We're already thinking, she's already making us think about the parable of the wise and foolish builder, the guy who builds his house on rock and it stands, the guy who builds his house on sand and it shifts and the house collapses. There's so much there just in that sentence that she turns from something really just very mundane to something very brilliant as she revises. So I'll come back in a moment to what we can tell about the revision of Northanger Abbey. And there's a bit, we can tell a bit, but more often we're dependent on conjecture. We certainly can't get the clarity of detail and focus that you get with Sanditon. We don't have the manuscripts. First, though, what about the history of publication, or rather this painfully extended history of non-publication, which so perfectly seems to dramatize the satire Austen puts in the novel. In chapter 5 of the novel, about a book trade caught on the one hand between an ossifying conservatism of taste, Milton, The Spectator, elegant extracts, and an obsession with the vacuously new, the formulaic Gothic imitators of Anne Radcliffe and the Mysteries of Udolpho. And then a book trade and associated institutions, reviewing periodicals, circulating libraries, in which even distinguished exponents of the new genre, the novel, like Frances Burney with Cecilia and Camilla, and Maria Edgeworth with Belinda, are disparaged, and youthful upstart talents like Jane Austen herself can't break into print. What happened, or rather what didn't happen, to create a time lag of almost 20 years before the novel we now know as Northanger Abbey reached print? And why did all this happen, or not happen? Let's go to the next slide. And alongside Cassandra's memorandum, which describes Northanger Abbey as being drafted when she's about 23 in 1798-99, Exhibit A is this advertisement, which Austen wrote for the novel, apparently in 1816, and which her brother Henry then had printed in the first edition. So the posthumous edition of December 1817, it has 1818 on the title pages, was common for year-end publications. So here it is. This little work was finished in the year 1803 and intended for immediate publication. It was disposed of to a bookseller. It was even advertised. And why the business proceeded no farther, the author has never been able to learn. This next sentence is great. You see how angry she is. She really spits it out. That any bookseller should think it worthwhile to purchase what he did not think it worthwhile to publish seems extraordinary. But with this, neither the author nor the public have any other concern than some observation is necessary upon those parts of the work which 13 years have made comparatively obsolete. The public are entreated to bear in mind 13 years have passed since it was finished, many more since it was begun, and that during that period, places, manners, books, and opinions have undergone considerable changes. Now, there are all kinds of things that are interesting in this brief notice with its that wonderfully Johnsonian flourish of regulated anger. One is Austen's sense of rapid social and cultural change between 1803, when she expects the novel to appear, and 1816, the year after the end of the Napoleonic War, when publication last seems within sight. And that's something that we can see in Persuasion as well. That's very much a novel, a post-war novel looking to a future that's going to be very different. There's also Austen's implication, since the novel might now seem belated, that she hasn't revised and updated it to take account of changed conditions. And that's an implication we know from some textual details is not true, since there are certain passages that could not possibly have been written by 1803 because they refer to things that weren't then in place. But let's focus for now on the main issue, what happened or didn't happen. And what does it tell us about the environment Austen had to navigate, the tastes she had to appeal to, the constraints she had to observe, and so on, as she wrote and revised and attempted to publish? So that dating of Northanger Abbey, most scholars have accepted it. They think that, I won't go into all the details, that, maybe she did indeed finish it in 1799, probably revised it again just before 1803. But the novel doesn't appear in print until late 1817, when out it comes with another publisher, John Murray, not the one she originally sold it to. So, if all this is right, if Cassandra's memorandum is right, Northanger Abbey is the third of Austen's full-length novels to have been drafted, but it's the one with the longest time lag between composition and publication. The paradox is that we also know it was the first of the novels that she successfully sold to a publisher. She didn't make it, she didn't manage it with First Impressions. This time with Northanger Abbey, or Susan as it's then called, she aims lower. She goes for the mid-ranking London firm of Crosby & Co., whose proprietor, a man named Benjamin Crosby, had published some quite well-known novels in the 1790s, William Godwin's Caleb Williams, for example, and he was now expanding his fiction list, and he was, in fact, the fourth most prolific publisher of novels in the first decade of the 19th century, between 1800 and 1810. We can now track that kind of thing really quite easily, thanks to bibliographical work that's been done by in the last 20 years or so. The transaction took place at some stage in the spring of 1803 when Crosby bought Austin's manuscript for £10, more than obviously than it would be now, but really kind of a low price, a rock bottom price. And that year, Crosby and Co. published a total of 10 new novels in 1803. And they advertised Susan as in the press. Could we get the next slide where I'm showing you one of these advertisements? They advertised Susan, as in the press, thanks. They advertise it in two of their other publications, then they advertise it in a fashionable London newspaper, and then they advertise it in at least 7 provincial newspapers throughout the summer. And this is one of the provincial newspapers, and this incidentally is one that Jane Austen probably would have seen herself. This is like her local newspaper, the Hampshire Chronicle. That's the county she's living in. But Susan never appeared. There it is advertised in the press. You can see it there on the screen at the bottom of the ad. In the press, Susan 2 vols, but it never appeared. And it's worth just mentioning the research resources here, and particularly the game-changing availability of early newspaper databases containing this kind of page. Amazing that so many of these survive and can be accessed online with subscription. Which has just given us so much more knowledge than we previously had about this mystery of what happens to Susan. The hunt has been on for ads for 1803 ads for this novel for a century now. The first one was discovered by R.W. Chapman in 1923. Then in 2006, somebody discovers a second, and then a third crops up in 2017. And then suddenly in 2021, a scholar named Margie Burns produces 7 more, and it's simply that we've now got access to this database and it's searchable. And it's not finding everything because it's working by optical character recognition, so it's not finding everything. But we now know that really this novel was advertised quite heavily. It did look like Crosby really did intend to publish it. He's advertising it around the country, as in the press. He's trying to build up advanced interest. But then it doesn't ever happen. So why? Now, some scholars have suggested that as a publisher of Gothic fiction himself, and Crosby's output in 1803, you can actually see some of those novels. Number 11, Mosscliffe Abbey, for example, and another one called The Mysterious Count. That's number 2, He publishes Gothic novels. And so, the theory is he might have been disinclined on reflection to publish a send-up of a genre that was serving him well. He might not have realized quite what this novel that he bought was like, and when he didn't want to publish it. And it's certainly the case that Northanger Abbey is a pretty relentless send-up of the Gothic vogue. This is quite well known, so I don't want to spend too long on it, but I've given you a few examples of how it does satirize the Gothic, and so what underlies this theory that that's why Crosby didn't want to go ahead and publish it. So if we go to the next slide, here is a passage from again, it's a long passage. I won't give you the whole thing. From I think chapter 6 of the first volume. I've given you the whole passage really because I wanted to show you the way Austen frames her characters chatting about Gothic novels with them chatting about fashion, clothes. Not Austen sort of suggesting that the newest fashion, the newest color of ribbon, or the newest kind of cloak or hat is a bit like the newest fashion in novels. It doesn't really mean anything, but everybody's got to have this certain thing. And they're in the middle of the page, or towards the end, actually, 3/4 of the way down. Isabella has made a list of the next lot of Gothic novels that they are going to read. Now that they've read Anne Radcliffe's, really rather good novels, The Mysteries of Udolpho and the Italian, they're going to read Castle of Wolfenbach, Clermont, Mysterious Warnings, Necromancer of the Black Forest, Midnight Bell, Orphan of the Rhine, and Horrid Mysteries. These will last us some time. And Catherine says, she's thrilled. It's pretty well, but are they all horrid? Are you sure they're all horrid? And for a long time, people thought, Austen must have just made these titles up. They're so ridiculous. Horrid Mysteries, Necromancer of the Black Forest. In fact, she didn't. They're all real. And in fact, we know from one of her letters that her father read The Midnight Bell aloud to the family soon after it was published. So Austen, knew this stuff. And it was real. And if we just quickly go to the next slide, I'll just alert you to, if you want to find more out about this, if we look at the next slide, which is another image. Yeah, that's it. That's from one of these novels, Mysterious Warnings, an illustration that really gives you a good sense of how melodramatic it all is. And I put a URL at the top of the screen of a web exhibition of all these novels. They've got them at the University of Virginia. So if you want to know more about these novels and see their title pages and find out what they're like, the so-called 7 Northanger novels, you can go to that URL, that website at the University of Virginia, and you can see them all. That's where I got that really corny illustration. Gothic novels, they're just consumer products like anything else, like coloured ribbons or cloaks. They're no different from the latest fashion in clothes, which change from year to year. That's really what Austen is doing with Gothic in the first volume. And of course, in the second volume, if we go to the next slide, she shifts her attention to the cliche-ridden style of Gothic schlock as Catherine searches the Abbey, and she's hoping to find an old manuscript narrative of ancient horrors and evil deeds. And of course, all she finds is a laundry list. And a candle goes out at the crucial moment, which always happens in Gothic novels. And here you get this parody, very close parody. Again, you can find these phrases in all bad Gothic novels of the 70s, 90s. And believe me, I've done it. You can find exactly these phrases. She just pearled them together. A lamp could not have expired with more awful effect. Catherine, for a few moments, was motionless with horror. It was done completely. Not a remnant of light in the wick could give hope to the rekindling breath. Darkness, this great sentence, darkness impenetrable and immovable filled the room. It's kind of like halfway between Milton and Mary Shelley. Darkness impenetrable and immovable filled the room. So she's doing that kind of send-up. And then if you look at the next passage on the page, you then get this rather explicit, famous renunciation of the Gothic genre as mere escapism, and this is from chapter 10 of volume 2. Charming, it's a famous passage. Charming is what all Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and Radcliffe, the Gothic novelist par excellence. Charming, even as were the works of her imitators, it was not in them, perhaps, that human nature, at least in the Midland counties of England, was to be looked for. In the central parts of England, there was surely some security for the existence, even of a wife not beloved, in the laws of the land and the manners of the age, because Catherine, of course, has suspected that General Tilney murdered his wife. Murder was not tolerated. Servants were not slaves, and neither poison nor sleeping potions to be procured like rhubarb from every druggist. So it seems like she's saying, Gothic novels are just fantasy. They got nothing to tell us about the real world. There are things to be said to qualify that. And in particular, it's an established interpretation of the novel, first fully outlined, I think, by a critic named Tony Tanner in the 1970s, that Catherine's experience throughout the novel actually is a modern version of Gothic evil translated into polite society. General Tilney really is a modern version of Anne Radcliffe's Montoni, and his ruling passion, anger, is reflected in the novel's title, Northanger Abbey. And in that respect, there's this theory which I buy into myself, that Austen isn't really attacking Gothic fiction so much as cleverly converting it and applying it to the present day. But even so, there's no question there's a lot of surface mockery of Gothic cliches. And that, some scholars say, is why Crosby didn't publish it. But would this really deter a publisher of Gothic from also publishing a send-up of Gothic? Let's go to the next slide. And I think the answer is no. Booksellers of the period had more pressing matters to think about than the curatorial purity of their lists. This was a profession notorious for high rates of bankruptcy. Publishers couldn't afford to specialize. They had to keep the product coming. And here's two examples of the way in which publishers of Gothic also did publish satires on Gothic. The one on the left, More Ghosts, ! It's published by the Minerva Press, the biggest publisher of Gothic schlock at the time. And he didn't see any contradiction in bringing out spoofs of Gothic alongside the real thing. And on the right, you've got the Three Monks, ! And that's published by Crosby in, I think, 1803. But it's published by him at around that time, certainly. And this is a sort of arch, mildly risque tale about crusaders who aren't there and they've left their wives behind, and their wives are all inviting in the local priests for illicit encounters. So, in short, the idea of protecting Gothic is the reason why Crosby didn't publish Northanger Abbey, didn't publish Susan, doesn't make sense. A more plausible explanation is provided by Anthony Mandel, another scholar who's done a lot of work on this, and he documents Crosby's escalating business difficulties in the period following his purchase of Austen's manuscript. And he suggests these difficulties underlie the sudden drop-off in his production of fiction, with just two new novels in 1804. Crosby had been very prolific in 1803, but the novels he published hadn't gained traction. He needed to retrench. He may have invested £10 in buying Susan from Austen the previous spring, but that was a small loss to absorb compared with £100 or so, which is quite a big amount of money that he would have had to lay out at his own risk to produce this 2-volume novel by an unknown author. It's a mundane explanation alongside the Gothic theory, but it's a better one. And again, it connects thematically with the text that is with Austen's quite angry analysis of the marketplace for fiction in chapter 5 of the novel. So what happens next? We're getting to the end of our slides, but the next one, if we could have the next slide, this is very faint, but it's an advertisement that came out in 1809. In that year, there's another novel, another 2-volume novel called Susan, published by another bookseller, John Booth. Austen kind of imagined that this was her own book. You can just about see from the advertisement how ridiculous the contents are. The heroine gets, trapped on a remote island. And it's rather like another novel called The Exile of Siberia. This is not the kind of thing Austen does. She kind of imagined that this was her own novel, but she probably did see this advertisement, and maybe she even saw the novel. And that's the moment when she writes quite angrily to Crosby to try to get her manuscript back. He's been sitting on it for 6 years by that time, and she tries to get it back and gets into a kind of tussle with him, and he refuses to send it back or says that you can buy it back. and Austen doesn't do that. Perhaps she doesn't have the ready money. But in any case, it's not until 1816 that she gets it back. And at that point, she composed that advertisement that we saw. And that advertisement seems to envisage immediate publication. But again, that doesn't happen in 1816. And there are various letters in which she talks about how she's writing Persuasion and she's revising Northanger Abbey, and then she's starting Sanditon, and her health is getting worse. And she even writes in one letter, and she's calling the novel at this point, she's changed the heroine's name from Susan to Catherine. She's calling it Catherine. Miss Catherine is put upon the shelf for the present. I do not know that she will ever come out. It does, but only after her death. What do we know about this revision? We're just looking at little fragments of evidence. As I said, we don't have a manuscript, but there are a few little smoking guns that give evidence of revision post-dating when she sold the manuscript to Crosby. I've already mentioned the praise for Maria Edgeworth's Belinda, which was published in 1801. More conclusively, if we go to the next slide, there's a reference to a street in Bath named Union Passage. Catherine gets stuck in traffic in Union Passage at the beginning of chapter 7. Could we have a look at the next slide? That's it. And the extract that I've given you is another one. So she gets stuck in Union Passage, but it wasn't called that until a few years later. And then there's this passage where she seems to be really kind of stealing from another text that was not published, had not been published when she sold the manuscript to Crosby. And it's where Catherine uses the word nice. And she's teased by Henry for using this vague word. Oh, very true, said Henry. This is a very nice day, and we're taking a very nice walk, and you're two very nice young ladies. Now, this is a fashionable word. Every commendation on every subject is comprised in that one word. And Austen, pretty clearly, you can see the passages I've bolded, is, let's say, inspired by a letter that had been written in the mid-18th century by a woman named Lady Bradshaw, and she sends it to the novelist Samuel Richardson. But it didn't get into print until after 1803. Everything clever and agreeable is comprehended in that word. Frequently astonished to hear such a one as a sentimental man. We were of a sentimental party. I've been taking a sentimental walk. T.S. Eliot allegedly once said, good writers borrow, great writers steal. And that is what Austen is doing here. And that shows us, that just gives us this lovely little glimpse of her revising, sharpening her novel, intensifying the satire on language here. At a late stage after she sold Susan to Crosby. A couple of other things. I mean, it's been argued quite persuasively that some elements of Austen's later style, specifically her use of free and direct discourse to represent character, speech, and thought, are intermittently present in the text with a concentration in the second volume. So most of it is in her early style, without much use of free and direct discourse. But if we go to slide 6, the next slide, I think this is the last slide that I've given you. Yeah, this is a moment from chapter 1 of volume 2, where we go into free and direct discourse, and that means that we're getting the perceptions of Catherine. With the narrative is filtered through her point of view, and so we're not really getting narrative information here. We're getting narrative disinformation because she doesn't understand what's happening. She thinks General Tilney's a nice guy, and he's not. And so Austen is kind of communicating that between the lines to us. She's hinting that while giving us Catherine's view of General Tilney, where she's kind of puzzled. Something's wrong, but how could that be anything to do with the general because he's such a nice man? And obviously it is to do with the general because he's not. So just to, read you the relevant part of it. It had been a release to get away from General Tilney. It puzzled her to account for all this. It could not be General Tilney's fault. And of course, it is General Tilney's fault. That he was perfectly agreeable and good-natured and altogether a very charming man did not admit of a doubt. Well, it should admit of a doubt. He's not like that at all. For he was tall and handsome and Henry's father. He could not be accountable for his children's want of spirits or for her want of enjoyment in his country. And he is accountable. He is the reason. He's a bully. He intimidates his children, but Catherine doesn't understand that. So here's one argument. We can't prove it, but it's quite a plausible one that we're getting the way Austen writes in Emma or Persuasion cut into Northanger Abbey at certain moments, and that's a sign of late revision. And the one other thing that I think we could add to that is the fact that she is, we do know from this letter, she's revising Northanger Abbey almost with one hand while she's composing Persuasion with the other. And these two novels, we could go to the last slide, really do speak to one another. They were published together. They were posthumously published together. So the final slide now, I think, will show us that 4-volume set. We'll get to it in a minute, that last slide. But anyway, it's not really necessary. It's just a picture of 4 books. There it is. That's how they were published. 2 volumes of Northanger Abbey, volumes 1 and 2, 3 and 4 of Persuasion. And these are novels that are interestingly linked in all kinds of ways. I don't think any Austen's critic has really unpacked this, but they're most urban novels. We associate her with rural life. Austen famously once said 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. But these are urban novels, or at least partly so, set in Bath, set in the same place, now a World Heritage Site, but then really like the Las Vegas of the 18th century, a shark tank, a predatory social behavior that gave her satire free rein. So with volume 1 of Northanger Abbey in Bath and volume 4 of the set, volume 2 of Persuasion in Bath, the 4-volume set has got an almost kind of palindromic construction. It's bookended by critical sequences of episodes in Bath, a place of peril, but also fascination and opportunity for Austen's protagonists. So, to conclude, alongside the Gothic narrative mysteries of Northanger Abbey, did General Tilney kill his wife? Perhaps he kind of did, but that's another story. We have the book historical mystery of how and why Benjamin and Richard Crosby killed what would otherwise have been Jane Austen's first published novel. We still don't really know for sure, but in attempting to figure it out, we learned a great deal about the marketplace for fiction that is one of Austen's main themes in Northanger Abbey before the novel genre rose to its critical prestige and market dominance later in the 19th century. The novel also marks a crucial step towards that dominance and prestige, especially in chapter 5, which we've talked about. But it also shows us that as things stood at the turn of the 18th or the 19th and the 19th centuries, Austen still couldn't write exactly what she wanted to write, and she certainly couldn't publish it with any ease. As the great modernist novelist Virginia Woolf wrote in her famous counterfactual essay, Jane Austen at 60, if Austen had lived another 20 years, she'd have had a great deal more freedom, but we can only guess at what she would have done with it. I must stop there. Thank you very much. I've gone too long. Thank you very much for your patience. And it's lovely to have the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you very much for, I knew you were going to come up with some very interesting and new stuff. You always do. And I was very impressed by your, by the beginning of your talk when you talk about the dinosaur thing.
Yes.
Can you, no, it's just that I would like to know the name of the scientist again.
Mary Anning. Mary Anning. and there is a movie about her called Ammonite.
Ah, yes. I was going to. I thought
which
so.
is
That's why I was going. I wanted to make sure that
very
I had thought about
freely based on her life. But Mary Anning lived and had a shop. Her father had a shop in Lyme Regis, which Austen visited, and which of course is a key environment in persuasion. There's one Austen novel where she actually mentions going to that shop, so she almost certainly met Mary Anning, and they were already beginning to discover these, these fossils. They didn't know what they were, but they were already beginning to discover. And actually, in Persuasion, there is quite a lot of language of the reptilian. That one of her relatives, who she's expected to marry at one point, is described as lizard-like, and I just wonder whether there's something going on there. But Mary Anning.
You mentioned her, and I've seen the film, but I never made a connection between that Mary and Jane Austen, of course. Thanks for clarifying that for me. But I was while you were talking, a lot of ideas came up here, and I was thinking about a number of things, and they're just comments or very silly questions, I would say. First of all, you also prepared the Oxford Classics edition of Pamela, and you show in that in your edition, I mean, in the preparation of this edition, how many changes there were in other revisions that Richardson himself introduced into the novel because of the kinds of reactions, etc., etc. So, and this, of course, came up. I remember that because I was exactly going to ask you what you finally mentioned by the end of your talk about the revisions that Northanger Abbey might have gone through. And you, as you say, there is no manuscript, but you can actually sort of, from the kind of research you've done, you can almost, let's say, prove that this revision has been done, right? Has been made by her, right? So, I was also surprised by the trigger warning in the case of Austen.
Yeah.
God, what's going on? It's just something. No, we've had that as well. We've been having that as well quite frequently. I mean, and I also, just to give you a sense of what's happening now, I was discussing. Sorry, I was discussing Pamela with my students at the beginning of this term, and it was not a trigger warning, but I actually caught myself saying in class that there would be scenes of bullying, of sexual harassment, and all that, because you never know how students are going to react to the reading these days. And it's the first time I've ever done that. So, but I was surprised in the case of Jane. It does seem odd, doesn't it? It does seem so odd because there's nothing there that might actually provoke some kind of trigger warning. But anyway, that's just a comment. And so I was going to ask you about the revisions of Northanger Abbey, which of course you mentioned. But there's something that always caught my attention and always made me very intrigued, because I can't remember who said this or who mentioned this, but I remember having read at some point somebody thinking or finding chapter 5 in Northanger Abbey ironical. Would you go with that? Because I find it so straightforward. So it's a moment when actually this first person voice appears and makes a defense of the novel. What do you think of this?
Well, just a couple of things. I mean, I think one is that Jane Austen is so much written about and discussed, and we all feel we have to say something new. So the sometimes quite implausible ideas, will get advanced, and they're just because they're new. I wonder if that's what's happening here. I mean, the other thing I suppose I would say is that my colleague, my retired colleague here, Linda Hutchin, great literary theorist, wrote an amazing book about irony's edge, where she tries to be quite hard-headed about irony and to pin it down. And she talks about irony markers, and I think one can find irony markers in Austen. One can find moments where she's really saying, okay, I didn't mean this. And I don't see any of them there.
Exactly.
But I would be interested to know how that argument gets made. It's
because I as I say, I read it a long time ago, and it actually struck me as I've never read this as ironical at all. I think this is a moment in which it's very sincere. It's very straightforward. But anyway, I'm so happy that you actually confirmed my own reading, because I was, I said, it was. I think it was somebody important. I can't remember. But I felt maybe the person, the academic is right, the scholar is right, and I'm wrong. I don't know, but I don't see any of that because she's ironical so many times and so frequently that maybe the writer, the scholar thought that she might be doing the same thing there. But something that you also you also make very clear in your talk how the way Jane Austen was actually a reader, and because she was a reader, she could actually mobilize, deploy everything that she had in a way incorporated from her reading. And you also make that very clear, which is I think very interesting for our students to think about. The amount of reading that she made in her life in order to become the writer she became.
So she, I think it's true that when people say you can only really successfully parody something you love or something you're very drawn to, that one doesn't want to argue that her relationship to Gothic is really a hostile one. She clearly is immersed. I mean, we know from her letters, right, that she binge reads trashy fiction, and she says in one letter, we're a great family of novel readers, not afraid of being so. And we know that she read the Midnight Bell, for example, but just by chance, she probably read all those novels. And she was clearly, from the way she writes in Volume 2, she's just immersed in that stuff, and that's not a purely hostile response, is it? I mean, she sees how ridiculous this overwrought sublime prose is, but at a certain level she kind of relishes it and is brilliantly able to reproduce it. So yes, I mean, if only we knew more about exactly what she read. People of course go to great lengths to try to reconstruct what her library might have been like, or to try to find borrowing records and so on, and there's a lot of kind of conjecture, but she's a binge reader of pulp fiction, that's for sure.
And it's a pity that we have so few of her letters, and just to let you know about this. Our letters are being translated into Portuguese, right. And they are going to come out.
Did I meet when I came in person last time? Did I meet the former student who was doing that?
Yes, she was doing that. She's taken much longer than she expected.
Well, you said that. I mean, there are quite a lot of letters, and some of them are, and the level of annotation that they need is heavy.
Yeah. But I mean, it's coming out. The book's going to come out soon, and so it's a good thing that our students and the general public in Brazil will have access to.
Oh my gosh. I
there we
think
are.
Professor Sandra just maybe her
Her connection dropped.
She's back.
Dropped very, very quickly.
We
and
lost you for a moment there.
He came back. Yes, you've lost me for a moment. I don't know what happened. The connection just stopped. And so I know I was just sort of making comments here because I mean you've brought so much about the about this whole process of editing the novel and revising it. But you know, one of the things you said, and I think which is something I had never thought about, and I thank you for bringing this up, is the connection between Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. Because as you say, yes, we always say that they were published together. They came out after her death and all that. And at first, they seemed so different. But I mean, you convinced me now that they have a lot in common, in fact, which is something I had never thought about. And I thank you for that.
Yeah, I've never really seen anybody write about it because I'm sure there's much more to be said about that, and I'm not quite sure at the moment what it would be. But there are just certain really obvious and suggestive connections. Yeah.
Yes. And the first one is, which is obvious, is the let's say the setting. Bath is important in both of them, but it's something that I had never brought together, because you tend to read them, and sometimes it's difficult to put things together. And then I had never thought about it, which I find it's a very interesting point to make, and for the students maybe to think about it as well. But it's great.
I mean, yeah, my former colleague Deidre Lynch, who wrote the introduction to the World's Classics edition of Persuasion, has it's a beautiful introduction. It's very, very clever and witty and perceptive, and she says that one of the sort of odd and brilliant and disorienting things about Persuasion is that it's almost like the sequel to a novel that you haven't got. It's like a sequel to a courtship novel that went wrong.
Yeah.
And now it's being sort of put right again. But you're constantly looking back at something that you don't know the details of, and I feel that might be relevant here. If you think of Persuasion as almost sequel-like in its construction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, now that you have mentioned it, I remember the point she's making. Which is true. I mean, there's a novel missing there, or there's a novel that could have been written and wasn't. But I've been sort of using my prerogative here for too long. Let me see if we have any other questions here. Well, sorry, there are questions from the public, and I want now I don't want to take your time anymore. Let's see, Mariana. Are you going to ask the questions, or should I do that? How are we going to go about it? There you go.
Feel free to read them if you want.
Okay, I'll read the questions to you. Then we'll put them on the screen, and I'll read them to you. This is Maria Clara Biagioli. Maria Clara is a colleague of ours. She's also an academic, and she has been writing and studying Austen for a long time. So she'll certainly have some very interesting questions. So what do you take from Austen's effort to get Northanger Abbey's manuscript back versus her hesitation to publish it?
Yeah.
Wait a minute, Mariana, one at a time. Otherwise,
that's a different question.
Otherwise, Tom will get confused here.
Confused.
Question back. The first one by Maria Clara, please.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I remember it. That's good. I mean, that's a great question, and I moved it quite quickly through that bit because, of course, as you probably know, Maria Clara, that there are it's quite a tense exchange between Austen writing under a pseudonym what does she call herself? Mrs. Ashton Dennis, which enables her to sign this letter, MAD, M-A-D, I am Sir Mad, M-A-D. She's very angry. And Crosby writes back, or Crosby's son writes back, and kind of threatens legal action if she would publish it, if she's going to publish it with another publisher when he still owns it, and he threatens legal action. So it's pretty nasty, and then the trail goes cold. So we don't really know, whether she just did not have the money, or was so angry that she wouldn't pay, or was putting all her energy at that point into getting these other novels published, because by that time we're close to the publication of Sense and Sensibility in 1811. As for the slowness of publishing it once she finally does get it back, I don't know. I mean, I would be interested to know what you think. I guess I would probably just go to a biographical explanation that she's really busy at that time. She's writing Persuasion. She's starting to think about Sanditon. There's just a lot going on while her health is failing. And it may be, the way, I mean, I certainly feel this myself, it's often easier to write something new than go back to something old and revise it. It's quicker to do something new. And so maybe it's that, that's why she shelves Northanger Abbey and instead concentrates on Persuasion and Sanditon. I don't know. I mean, Maria Clara, do you have maybe the technology doesn't allow you to answer back, right?
Oh, she may try to write down something, and then we can show it to you. And let's see if she feels that she has a theory or a hypothesis about this. She can. But then we have the other question. That while she's answering your question, maybe we can move on to her next question. Do you believe she was fond of it as a darling child, like she said about Pride and Prejudice, but came to see it as more like her juvenilia?
And so might have been hesitant to publish it because she didn't think it was sufficiently mature or polished. I like to think she would have been happy when the juvenilia finally did get published in the 20th century. When people like Virginia Woolf and other modernists got very, very excited about this different Austen, who's not interested in realism and not interested in decorum, and is interested in breaking rules of narrative logic, rules of morality. But that's another question. So perhaps, she thinks of it as like the juvenilia, but on the other hand, the teenage writings, as they're sometimes called, but these youthful skits. But on the other hand, it is not the first full-length novel, or even the second full-length novel that she publishes. It's that she writes. It's the third. So it's not really a juvenile work. And if one looks at things like, Lady Susan, where she comes back to Lady Susan and writes a postscript to it at some later point, it looks like she envisages publishing that, although it never happens, or it doesn't happen until 1870. So I'm not sure. Not sure about that.
Mariana, I think, okay. Another question, but unrelated to Northanger Abbey. How did you face the challenge of choosing what to put into a short introduction to Austen among all that has been written about her?
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was 35,000 words. That was what I was allowed. And I think I took 38,000. And the format was quite a friendly one. It enabled, there was an opportunity to have a text box with a long quotation in every chapter. And so it wasn't then necessary to quote quite so much. elsewhere. And what I tried to do was give each novel a chapter that also introduced a particular topic. So the Pride and Prejudice chapter doubled up as the one about narrative technique. The Sense and Sensibility chapter doubled up as the one that was about money. And Persuasion, as I said, doubled up as the one that was about dinosaurs. So that was the juggling act I was trying to do. But yes, thank you. I mean, it's a very sympathetic question. That it's a ridiculous thing to have to do, to have to discard so much and distill so much while trying to say something that's new as well as just digesting what is already there. But I found it very helpful that I think so much Austen scholarship has been conditioned by that debate in the late 20th century between Marilyn Butler and Claudia Johnson about how you position Austen in relation to Wollstonecraft. Is she a conservative writer or is she an implicitly radical writer? And that also gave me a kind of a structure for doing the book. But it's this kind of thing is it's fun to do, and it has really great knock-on effects. I think since doing that, I've become less bloated and less verbose as a writer. It helps to make one, more economical.
Yeah. Well, what about this? Let's say contradictory vision. You mentioned Butler. You mentioned Johnson. Conservative, radical, something in between, conservative but also radical but also conservative. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Something in between.
Something in between, right?
Yeah. But I suppose this goes back to what I said about the idea of dividing Austen between Steventon and Chawton, and that picture of a more conservative writer emerging in the novels that she drafts from scratch at the end of the Napoleonic War. But what is great about Austen is the wonderful kind of inconsistency that there is. I mean, inconsistency sounds like a pejorative word, but the way that she has of being able to, the way that any great novelist has, I suppose, of being able to hold competing positions at the same time and articulate them or introduce them at the same time. I mean, I think the more I thought about her, the more I thought about her as a novelist debating with herself. And particularly as a novelist wedded to the social structure as it existed, but nevertheless tremendously alert to abuses and injustices within it, while not wanting, obviously, to overthrow it. So the Burkean Austen and the Wollstonecraftian Austen, I think they're both real, but they're neither complete.
Tension, maybe, would be a word to describe it. Some kind of tension between all these. I find it hard to think of her as purely conservative, to be quite honest. I think Butler's argument is a very sound one, very strong, but I find it hard to see her. But maybe politically, yes, but.
I think, Butler was an amazing scholar, really great scholar, and that book is a long time ago. Actually, it's 1975, I think, or something like that, and really kicked off that debate. And so she, can't be faulted, I suppose, for missing all the nuances that subsequently were made. It's because of her that we had that debate. But at the same time, I mean, I know from other, I taught with her for a period. I know what a great close reader she was, but she didn't do it there, and she was so much concerned with the surface, and she didn't really probe beneath the surface to find all those moments of discomfort and rebellion that are in Austen's prose that Claudia Johnson did such a good job of picking out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me just see if we again. Let's see. I don't think we have any other questions. Do we have any other questions, Mariana? Can you spot any?
No, we don't have. Just a comment by Maria Clara.
Okay. In answer to in answer to your. Oh God. You challenge her, and there she is. Yes, that's my hypothesis.
That is reassuring. But the one thing I would say is that Sanditon is such an amazing novel. You just got 10 chapters of it, and I think you can see Austen turning into Dickens in that novel. And who knows, where she would have gone. But it's very good humored. It's very, very genial. But nonetheless, it is very sharp about the commercialization and commodification of everything in the post-war period, and she's poking fun at it. But I just wonder where that's going.
And it's interesting how she actually kept up with the times, right? I mean, she was. You see progress in the sense of her sense of observation, and she really is keen on what is happening in the world.
Yeah, and Virginia Woolf says in that essay that I ended with, she's just about to become famous. It hasn't happened, but her reputation is growing. And at that point, she's going to go to London. She's going to hang out with important people. She's going to meet everyone. She's going to meet writers of all different kinds in all different genres. She's going to meet politicians and economists and journalists. And it's going to change the way she writes. But didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could go on talking about her for a long time. If you were here, I mean, if we were together in the same place, on the same continent, perhaps, we would now go. I would invite you for a coffee, and we could go on talking, or for a beer or something. We could go on talking about her for long. So, but I would like to thank you, because I don't want to, let's say, exploit you anymore. And I would really like you to come back to Brazil at some point, and let's hope this can happen.
Absolutely, yes. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's really great to have the opportunity to talk to you and your colleagues and your students, and I hope your undergraduates are enjoying Northanger Abbey.
I'm sure they will, or they have, or they did. I don't know. So anyway, thanks very much, Tom, for being with us once more, and I hope you have a good time in your Canadian spring.
I'm looking forward to it, and best wishes to all of you, and Mariana as well. Thank you as well for doing such an amazing job of hosting this virtually as well.
Yes,
it's been great.
Mariana is always very, very helpful, supporting us with the technicalities of StreamYard. Thank you, Mariana, and thanks everybody for being here with us. And bye-bye, Tom.
Bye-bye.
See you soon,
Bye-bye.
I hope.
Yes, I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Mariana?
Oi, acho que agora eu consigo. Agora sim. Consegue me ver, professora?
Tá live ainda, eu acho.
Sim. Deixa eu ver. Encerrando a transmissão. Acho que agora sim.